Welcome everyone, and welcome onliners, and thanks for joining us for this panel session on algorithm and barriers, journeys to access, understanding, and supporting underrepresented learners in higher education. My name is Yushan. I'm a PhD student at the department, and today we have four wonderful papers um, to be shared with among all of us, and also the colleagues. And we have research around progression and also the journey to higher education in terms of access and participation, and also the financial perspectives in Ghana. And so we have Lucrecia Faustina Sotelo from University Schools of Education. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce the Spanish. Rede esto sobre los inicio a la universidad. Sorry. And then we have Walid Hijazi and Natasha Wilson from Harvard Graduate School of Education, and Leon Vincent from its department, and then Brita Zawada from formerly Council on Higher Education, South Africa. And so I think for the first presentation, Lucrecia would be presenting in Spanish, and then Gonzalo has very kindly offered his help with translating. And then we'll move on to the following three presentations. But so 15 minutes of presentation, and I'll give you a reminder when there's only 2 minutes left, and then we'll have 5 minutes for Q&A if we have more time left, and then we'll maybe come back to all the presentations and to take more questions. Okay, so the floor is yours.
Puede empezar, Lucrecia.
Bueno, muy bien. Bueno, good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here from the south of the world. I will speak in Spanish, but my writing presentation is in English. Gracias, Gonzalo y Carla, por el auxilio. Lo que voy a presentar hoy es una parte de la investigación que llevamos adelante desde la Red de Estudios de Inicios a la Vida Universitaria, que se denomina Cartografías de la Desigualdad en la Educación Superior, cuyo tema es Desigualdades Múltiples en los Inicios de la Vida Universitaria, el caso de la Patagonia Argentina. El tema en el cual aquí nos centramos es en el reconocimiento que la primera vinculación del estudiante con la universidad es una problemática que presenta varios desafíos, dado que entrelaza las aspiraciones, los legados familiares, pero sobre todo las condiciones estructurales de los estudiantes en el ingreso a la universidad. Los inicios de la vida universitaria son abordados en esta investigación teniendo en cuenta un contexto específico que es la provincia de Santa Cruz, que presenta un nivel elevado de ingresos económicos, pero un costo de vida también elevado, alrededor de $1.300, además de marcas estructurales significativas en una baja escolarización, tanto a nivel primario como secundario, y ausencia de instituciones que favorezcan el consumo de bienes culturales, como por ejemplo teatros y cines. El foco del estudio está dado en la Universidad Nacional de la Patagonia Austral, que tiene sede en la provincia de Santa Cruz.
Yeah, the research is mainly discussing and interrogating the multidimensional nature of the encounter between students and the university, and is particularly relevant because it's interrogating this issue in a very specific context, which is in the south of Argentina, and where there is a huge economic disparity. There is a high level of income, but however, like this, it's very unequal in terms of income and also in levels of participation in schooling. this is also in the context of a very high life cost in the region, and other structural dynamics in the context that makes the context particularly challenging without many of the services that other regions in the country have. For example, access to cultural activities, theater, and others.
Para dar cuenta de este estudio, se proponen dos distintos conceptos que permiten trascender en un primer lugar la mirada del ingreso y considerarlos de los inicios a la vida universitaria. Ello propone superar la mirada del ingreso y circunscribirlo a que el ingreso es un trámite administrativo y que iniciar la vida universitaria implica construir un proyecto de vida, un oficio en otra institución. El otro concepto es la consideración de las desigualdades múltiples que propone François Dubet para analizar cómo diversos factores socioeconómicos, culturales, territoriales y de género configuran la primera vinculación con la universidad. La otra llave conceptual es el de experiencia estudiantil, que también se vincula con la propuesta de François Dubet y dialogando con Bernard Charlotte, en cuanto que la experiencia es está marcada por la singularidad de los procesos individuales y que definen las relaciones con el saber que el estudiante, al igual que la docencia, construye en la universidad, de manera tal que permite construir una determinada gramática institucional. Este grupo de conceptos se lee en un contexto específico de la Argentina con la sanción de la ley 27.204, en la cual la universidad se presenta como gratuita, es gratuita, no se paga ningún tipo de arancel en ninguno de los trámites, y les pido disculpas por los sonidos externos. Es gratuita, irrestricta y libre. Esta ley se llamó la Ley Puigros, y esta transformación sobre la gratuidad y las condiciones de accesibilidad a la educación superior permitieron reconfigurar este escenario.
The research is based in three main theoretical approaches. The first one is trying to move the focus from the access as a mere administrative act toward to trying to think the contact between a student and the institution as for framing as a beginning and trying to understand it in a more complex and multidimensional way. Also, it draws on in the theory of François Dubet about the multiple inequalities, which are not just socioeconomic, but also cultural, territorial, and based on gender. It also focuses on the experience of the student and how these individual processes encounter some particular institutional frameworks and what are the dynamics in that encounter. And this is especially important in the context of the Argentinian policy, which recognized higher education as free and unrestricted. So the access in Argentina to higher education in Argentina is based in this democratic ideal in which anyone can access to the university, but also it presents some challenges regarding the inclusion of a student and not trying not to frame it as an access, as an issue of access, but also trying to understand what is the lack of some symbolic capitals in these beginnings in the universe.
El otro grupo de conceptos que trabajamos en este análisis tienen que ver con dos conceptos centrales que tienen que ver con nos permiten pensar los inicios de la vida universitaria a partir de 4 dimensiones. El acceso y la admisión, es decir, las políticas y barreras socioeconómicas que eso permite o que favorecen el ingreso a la vida universitaria, la articulación entre la escuela secundaria y la universidad como zona de pasaje o como transición, el acompañamiento pedagógico entendido en términos de pedagogía de acompañamiento, y el aprendizaje del código académico, es decir, la escritura y la lectura, lo que permite que el estudiante pueda formar parte de esos procesos. Y la otra lente conceptual tiene que ver con las condiciones de accesibilidad, y aquí tomando aportes de Burbules y Callister, la noción de justicia social en educación, de Duvet también, en cuanto a los modelos de igualdad, de acceso, de oportunidades y resultados, y los conceptos de Fraser, de redistribución y reconocimiento, en cuanto que permiten tensionar el diseño de políticas para abordar la injusticia socioeconómica y analizar lo que una autora argentina sostiene que empezó a emerger a partir de la implementación de las políticas de nueva era, que se llama la inclusión excluyente.
I'm going to focus in the second part of this slide. The research is also drawing in ideas, conceptual ideas from Nancy Fraser, for example, in the idea of recognition, in order to put in tension socioeconomic injustice and trying to avoid some dangers of having people accessing to the higher education, but not being recognized in their symbolic and another injustice that can be part of these beginnings in the life in the university.
En cuanto a la perspectiva metodológica, se hizo un análisis mixto, cualitativo y cuantitativo. En el análisis cualitativo se trabajó sobre grupos focales con estudiantes de todo el periodo del confinamiento y posconfinamiento, del 2020 al 2023, y estrategias de análisis aplicados para los estudios biográficos, fueron talleres de escritura, y también la aplicación en cuanto al análisis cuantitativo, de una encuesta a estudiantes desde el 2020 hasta el 2023. A partir de ahí se hizo una integración analítica sobre los conceptos presentados recientemente. Gonzalo, si te parece, paso a los hallazgos. Bien. En relación a los hallazgos y los primeros resultados de esta investigación, en primer lugar, destacamos el perfil del estudiante de la Universidad Nacional de la Patagonia Austral, que es un estudiante de la provincia de Santa Cruz, última provincia del continente americano. En el perfil podemos destacar que la mayoría es femenina, en un 76%, joven. Este es un dato para la Argentina significativo, en cuanto que la población estudiantil en nuestro país va desde los 30 años, es decir, ingresa a la universidad personas que tienen más de 30 años, salvo en Santa Cruz, que el ingreso está entre los 18 y los 22 años de edad. Es decir, que terminan la escuela secundaria e ingresan a la universidad. Más de la mitad no es oriunda de la provincia de Santa Cruz. Eso sigue manteniendo el perfil migracional de nuestra provincia, que fue poblada por migrantes y que se sigue sosteniendo en esa característica. Y la matrícula de las 4 sedes de la Universidad Nacional de la Patagonia Austral es fundamentalmente de estudiantes que viven en las localidades donde las unidades académicas se encuentran insertas. Como dije recién, el contraste socioeconómico de la provincia es significativo. El índice per cápita familiar es del 25,6%, el más alto, uno de los más altos del país. Sin embargo, mantiene con datos del año pasado, pero que redundan en el 2025, del 30% del índice de pobreza, y de indigencia el 8%. Y esto convive con un elevado costo de vida, como dije recientemente, de cerca de $1.300. Las condiciones del estudiantado: casi la mitad de los estudiantes de la UMPA trabaja, el 47%, el 51% en la región patagónica reporta doble jornada de trabajo, o sea que de este 47%, más de la mitad tiene doble trabajo. Alta dependencia a las ayudas económicas, no solamente becas de estudio, sino subsidios de alquiler, de gas, distintos tipos de ayudas que el Estado argentino daba hasta el año pasado. Destaco este tema porque la investigación terminó el año pasado y este año esas ayudas no están, o sea que estos porcentajes, esta realidad aún se vería más agudizada. Muchos de estos estudiantes son primera generación universitaria, donde las madres de estos estudiantes solo han terminado la escuela primaria. En este sentido, el rol de la universidad es muy importante porque es un agente clave en términos de Fraser para considerar la redistribución y el acceso formal a la gratuidad de la educación superior.
Lucrecia described the profile of the students in the university, mentioning that they are mainly women and they are very young in general, which is an important point in the Argentinian context because many of the students have more than, there are a lot of mature students in Argentina with more than 30 years old. So this is a profile that is particularly young. It is also a province, a region in the country where there is a huge inequalities. There is a very high income in average, one of the highest in the country, however, 30% of poverty. The students are mainly, a big part of the students are working while they are studying, and also and they rely in financial support from the state, which is critical now because the government is now ending that support. And also many of them are first generation students in their families with their mothers mainly possess primary education.
Bien. Los otros resultados que tienen que ver ya con las huellas de la pandemia en la enseñanza remota de emergencia, los inicios a la vida universitaria, encontramos que la experiencia general es negativa, y yo creo que esto es un dato compartido en todo el mundo. En cuanto a la accesibilidad tecnológica desigual, a pesar de la alta conectividad domiciliaria, el 94%, se presentan problemas de calidad de conexión y disponibilidad de dispositivos personales fueron cruciales, un desafío mayor en la extensa Patagonia. Los obstáculos pedagógicos y simbólicos, dificultades para entender los contenidos, falta de interacción durante la enseñanza remota de emergencia, falta una alta tasa de abandono en la escuela secundaria que incidió de manera significativa en los inicios a la universidad, que llevó a decrecer la matrícula de ingreso a la universidad, y una fuerte sensación de no entender que afecta la autoconfianza y la construcción del oficio universitario. El impacto socioemocional, altos niveles de estrés, ansiedad y aislamientos reportados, subraya esto la necesidad de una pedagogía que acompañe este cambio en los procesos de aprendizaje del estudiantado. Las huellas de la pandemia se superponen y profundizan las desigualdades preexistentes.
This is about the effects of the pandemic in the student, and there are two types of effects. The first one are more material and are related with poor connections and the need to have access to some devices and some connections in their houses. But also challenges that are more symbolic and more pedagogical about the perceptions and challenges to understand the contents during the university and how that affect the academic self-esteem and also produces stress and anxiety among the students. And this is like making the inequalities deeper than before after the pandemic.
Bien, los resultados, 3, motivaciones, expectativas y desafíos territoriales en la Patagonia. Las motivaciones para estudiar en la UMPA, combinaciones de pragmatismo, progreso, es decir, la búsqueda de un progreso profesional y empleo, esa idea de la universidad como movilización social sigue sosteniéndose y fuertemente influenciado por el apoyo familiar y por la idea de poder entrar a trabajar a una de las fuentes principales de empleo de la región que tiene que ver con la mina y el petróleo, aunque se ve desafiada en este contexto justamente en una fuerte transformación del mercado laboral en relación fundamentalmente al petróleo con la retirada de YPF de la región. También genera expectativas ambivalentes, un deseo fuerte de éxito académico y fuerte valoración de la socialización tras el aislamiento pandémico, pero con la conciencia de la dificultad y notable carga de ansiedad y temor al fracaso que genera volver a encontrarse con otro, volver a encontrarse con la universidad, con los docentes, y la sensación de no haber aprendido nada en este momento de aprendizaje remoto de emergencia que nosotros lo hemos llegado a denominar arrojo a la virtualidad. Es decir, no quedó otra posibilidad que estudiar en la virtualidad y es por eso que atravesamos esta situación. Es lo que expresan los estudiantes en este estudio. Una presencialidad idealizada, que estudiar de manera presencial es como la necesidad de poder encontrarme, pero además porque allí es donde voy a aprender de manera significativa. Los desafíos territoriales de la Patagonia, que más allá de la conectividad digital, las vastas distancias impactan en el acceso físico a las sedes. La Universidad Nacional de la Patagonia Austral tiene 4 sedes, donde cada una de las sedes tiene una distancia entre sí de 400 kilómetros, y eso hace que permitan que los estudiantes que viven lejos de las localidades puedan estudiar, pero acceder a ellas resulta bastante difícil, ¿no? Ese es el desafío territorial y la fuerte contradicción.
About the motivation, expectations, and regional challenges, okay? The motivation of the university still is understood and seen as a driver of social mobility, and especially in order to insert or trying to work in the extraction of commodities. That is the main industry in the region, but that is changing as well because the main public company in extracting petrol oil is, I think, is closing. Understood. There is also ambiguous anticipation and the emergence of anxiety and stress in the encounter with others after the pandemic, and this has produced, and there is an impression, a sensation that they didn't learn properly. So this has produced like an idealization of the presence, idealization of in-person educational activities, which is contradictory with the challenges of the territory, because the different campuses of the university are distant at something like 400 kilometers. So if I understood well, online education could be a very good opportunity in order to connect and to allow access. However, after the pandemic, is seen as something that is of lower quality. Or
I'm just conscious of time.
I think there are a couple of.
Nos quedan 2.
There is just a couple of slides. So
Okay, because I think we probably should move on to
yeah, we're gonna go faster now.
in just 1 or 2 minutes. Yeah.
Ya, podemos terminar, Lucrecia.
Sí, voy terminando entonces. En este tema, entonces, voy a leer lo siguiente. Aquí esta investigación presenta una fuerte tensión entre la redistribución y el reconocimiento, que se vuelve crucial para favorecer los accesos a la educación superior en sociedades desfavorecidas, periféricas, como los de la Patagonia Austral. El desafío de la pospandemia radica en fortalecer las políticas de reconocimiento. Voy a adelantar aquí. Las políticas de reconocimiento, esto implica reconocer activamente la singularidad de las trayectorias marcadas por esta experiencia común, pero vivida diferencialmente en la heterogénea Patagonia. Requiere reconocer las posibles brechas sin estigmatizar, validar las ansiedades y temores expresados y valorar la diversidad de puntos de partida. Un enfoque basado solo en la igualdad formal de oportunidades, sin considerar estas desigualdades acumuladas y las secuelas pandémicas, corre el riesgo de reproducir la exclusión bajo un manto meritocrático, ignorando la brecha entre el estudiante esperado y el estudiante real que ingresa al sistema universitario. Bueno, muchas gracias y dejo aquí algunas preguntas que cierran la investigación y bueno, muchas gracias por el tiempo de escucha.
Lucrecia finished the presentation highlighting the tension between distribution and recognition and the need to strengthen the recognition politics, acknowledging the different trajectories and the diversity of the beginning of students when access to a university, and trying to overcome or going beyond the focus just on access, which can reproduce the myth around meritocracy, for example, without acknowledging properly what are the conditions in which that university life started. And she left these questions for further discussion. Muchas gracias, Lucrecia.
Gracias.
So I'm just conscious of time. And I assume like all 4 presenters would be with us. So shall we maybe move on to the next presentation, and then if you have some questions, and we save them at the end of if that's okay with the request, yeah.
Yeah, we are going to move to the next presenter, and we are going to collect the questions. Sorry. Vamos a movernos al siguiente la siguiente persona presentando, y al final de la sesión vamos a tener, recoger las preguntas.
Okay, cool.
Sorry.
Thank you, Christian. And I really enjoyed your presentation. And without further ado, let's welcome Walid and also Latasha from Harvard Graduate School of Education, and the floor is yours.
All right. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Just testing audio. Perfect.
Yes.
And one more check is, can you actually see my presentation?
Maybe can you share the presentation mode, and then we can see the larger text. It's fine.
Is it
okay?
Is it visible or not yet?
Yes. Now it's working. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining from. So today we're going to be talking about financing equitable access to higher education in the case of Ghana. So basically, it's part of a research Latasha and myself have been working on early on this year, I think around Q1, so like the timeline of March, April. And we're going to be presenting to you some of the challenges and opportunities that we've been observing, especially through the increasing demand towards higher education. So a bit of a quick introduction about both of us. My name is Walid Hijazi. I come from a consulting background. I've been delivering strategic and transformational projects in the educational sector in procurement, as well as in-country kind of value creation. And I've been doing such projects within the academic sphere as well as corporate professional development. And also joining me today, Latasha Wilson. She's a certified public accountant. She has more than a decade of expertise in finance, accounting, and also education sectors. She's the founder of Alluvium, a financial consulting firm, and also she co-founded Cornerstone Enterprise, which is an educational training nonprofit organization. So the agenda for our presentation, and we'll try to be conscious of time as well, would like to start by sharing a bit of the context of Ghana, like what's going on, how is the educational scene, what is tertiary or higher education there. And then we're going to be presenting 3 key ideas that we actually observed throughout our research, and we kind of clustered them or blocked them into topics. So the first topic will be on the technical and vocational learning, especially across rural communities or rural areas. The second topic will be trying to identify alternative sources of funding, and here we're going to shed the light on partnerships with the private sector. And then the third topic will be student loan trust fund, and here we're going to be mentioning income contingent repayments, and towards the end we'll be wrapping up with next steps. So Latasha will take us through like the context, topic 1 and 2, and then I'll take over topic 3 and conclude. So now I'm handing over to Latasha.
Natasha, you're still okay. No, we can't hear you.
Okay, can you? Try for mine.
Okay, should I continue? Yeah.
We can hear you now.
Now we can hear you.
But you need to maybe
This is my mic.
Yeah.
now we can hear you.
Okay, now can you hear me? Can
Yeah.
you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, sorry. Okay, I'm gonna step through this. Waleed, you'll move the slides,
Yeah.
correct? So I'm gonna just give a quick context of Ghana. They have Ghana is unique in the sense that they were one of the first African countries that gained their independence in 1957. They have over 35 million citizens. And what's striking about that is the diversity in that country. They have over 50 indigenous languages, in addition to the fact that they have a rich culture that has single-handedly had education be one of the most pivotal pieces of the nation's success. And so that's why we were so interested in understanding and learning more about the complexity of this country and its education system. To the next slide. Any country that has any success as it relates to their economic mobility, it's all tied to just that. And so, although Ghana has increased their number of citizens, they've increased the number of students that that are within their that is within their population educational system. That has brought increases in their economic gains, but also it has also taxed the system. So let me step back for a minute. The first thing is that their GDP per capita has grown from 400 to over 2,000. This is all driven by their agricultural system, the manufacturing system, as well as the service sector. Even with that, the working poverty rate of 22%, which is only 1 out of 5 jobs, actually provide a living wage. So education is the lever that is used in order to change these metrics. 75%, which is the largest component of their employment sector, is informal, and a high youth unemployment is also driving or pushing against some of this success. One of the reasons why we wanted to look at the mix of what's happening from what are the true drivers for their GDP based on the mix of what's happening from an educational sector that feeds into the working sector, because we know that mix impacts the long-term sustainability of the entire system. So that's some of the things that we're going to talk about. The first step that I wanted to do is I wanted to go and look at the enrollment rates of education. Next slide. So the country has increased. I wonder why mine's not moving. The country has increased. Let's do this. No, it's just not moving for me. One of the key issues is the enrollment has increased, mainly due to the fact that the country has pushed policies for universal education at the lowest levels of their education system, all the way up to the tertiary. That increase has allowed and gave access to more citizens within their country, but the expenditures the expense that the expenses that the government has set aside in order to fund education has not kept pace with those enrollment. And that's what you can see here, where the expenditures as a percent of GDP has declined over the years. That is having a significant impact on limiting or allowing for cost sharing. It is requiring cost sharing for the citizens. That is increasing the financing costs for education for those citizens. And those two pieces are impacting the long-term sustainability of the entire system. So we are proposing just a couple of suggestions. The first one is regarding just access to education in rural communities, particularly for technical and vocational education. This approach we've seen be successful in the Netherlands. So the first thing is that the funding that is given, even if you move a small percentage of the funding that goes into education, anywhere from a 1 to a 6% allocation for this particular fund based on what the Netherlands were able to do, which is a consistent model of how the system is set up for Ghana, there can be a 20% increase in the teacher salaries. This will improve instructional quality. It will increase interdisciplinary learning. It would allow for the labor market to actually go, or allow for students to go directly from high school into the labor market, which is something that's really important. And it also will improve economic mobility for some of their citizens. The second thing that we think is where we spent the most time is looking at the cost sharing component of education within Ghana. The Student Loan Trust Fund is one of the most important pieces that is used for students in order to gain access to education. However, that increase that we talked about before, the enrollment rates of nearly 600,000 students, is testing the capacity of that fund in order to provide the necessary financing needed for students, to the point where the fund right now only covers 10 to 20% of the actual need for students when they step into higher education or tertiary education. Last year, the student fund, this was actually in 2023, implemented a no guarantor policy, which was significantly important for students in Ghana. However, that increased the number of disbursements to that fund, giving access for students to be able to have financing for their education. It was an increase of 60%. However, because the fund had limited sources of funding, the repayment and recovery rates remained pretty stagnant, only at like 26%. So only 26% of the students that actually receive funding from the student loan fund are able to actually repay. Their goal is to have that at 60 to 70%. So in order to support the long-term sustainability of the fund, we recommend increasing the sources for funding, restructuring the repayment terms, as well as providing education for students. We believe that this will allow for these changes, something simple as increasing the repayment term from 10 years to 20 years. Our modeling, based on the models that we've put together, this can increase that repayment recovery rate from 26% to 70%. We've seen this work in Colombia, in South America, in their access with quality of higher education program. The last thing that I'll speak about, which is another approach to increasing the alternative sources for funding, so that students have access to finance their education, is to expand or increase or provide a program that we're calling it an employer-sponsored loan repayment benefits program. We suggest that employers offer a portional repayment matching for employees, and then in turn, they can receive a tax subsidy. This will work to shift the employer-employee relationship from a loan enforcer to an investor. This is offering the benefit can provide overall job satisfaction as well as increased productivity, reduce turnover, and strengthen the competitiveness. This is going to hit the bottom line as it relates to the economic mobility of the country as well. The third is the lack of financial literacy and training for student borrowers. That is also a contributing factor to poor repayment habits. We propose that they incorporate a financial training and coaching program that fosters a culture of repayment and also will improve the overall well-being of Ghanaians. We think these things will be very successful because we've seen it done. When I mentioned the program that happened in South America, that resulted in a 90% increase in access for their students and their citizens to tertiary education. With those things, I will go ahead and pass it over to Waleed.
All right, thank you, Latasha. Just do another sound check. Can you hear me, everyone? Well, all right. So the third idea is actually delving into the student loan trust fund. And here we're discussing the income contingent repayment. So in addition to like the facility that Latasha has mentioned about the ability to borrow money for the Ghanaian students, one of the biggest issues that hinders students from accessing these loans is actually the loan repayment requirement. And in this case, we're highlighting the interest rates. Loan repayments impose or carry an interest rate of up to 12%, and that is applicable to the students after they get employed. And although the language suggests it's up to 12%, the formula is quite interesting. So if you look at the table on the left-hand side, the formula works as it captures the treasury bill rate plus 2%. And the treasury bill rate, as you can see on the table below, for the month of June, for example, this year is around 15%. So that will equate to 17%. This makes 12% is the kind of continuous interest rate that students need to pay or need to kind of account for. With such rigid terms and with such fixed schedule, graduates do struggle, first of all, with unemployment. They also do struggle with low earnings. And as you can see, like there is one statistical point that for fresh graduates in Accra, for instance, salaries are at 1,080 American dollars annually, and that equates to $90 a month for fresh graduates. So with such percentage, it actually diminishes the number of students who apply. And the graph to the bottom left tries to capture the number of applicants to such facility. And as you can see, it's kind of decreasing dramatically. So what we're really proposing here is we recommend adopting an income contingent repayment model. And that requires borrowers to repay a fixed percentage of their income only when they earn above a certain threshold. And there are like multiple examples around us. And here we just decided to highlight two of them. So in the UK, for instance, for undergrad students, the threshold for repayment is £25,000 a year, the latest. And that, like in terms of some characteristics of the ecosystem, it includes 9% interest rate, and the entire ecosystem actually has witnessed less than 30% default or partial. Of course, this doesn't suggest any causation, like because of the interest or because of the threshold, but the ecosystem has been seeing like high percentage of repayment. And when it comes to New Zealand, for instance, the threshold is also like around 22,000 New Zealand dollars, and then the ecosystem there imposes no interest on student loan repayment, and the entire system there has been successful in kinds of repayment. The reason why we think such model could work in the case of Ghana is the alignment to the governmental vision of expanding access to tertiary education. And also, this is kind of providing a potential of also increasing the percentage of repayment, as also Latasha highlighted. The infrastructure is ready already. There is the existence of Ghana card. So theoretically speaking, this can be used to debit the amount. And finally, it enhances some sort of revenue sustainability. So in order to recap, we've kind of touched on Ghana's context. We kind of presented our approach to enhancing technical and vocational accessibility within rural communities. We looked at the partnerships with the private sector as alternative funding, the private sector to be more of an investor rather than borrower, lender. And when it comes to the student loan trust fund, is like to implement income contingent sort of repayment model. In terms of next steps, we really want to substantiate our research through like more interviews with key affiliated stakeholders. And here we're referring to the committee that worked on the Ghana Vision 2030, and that is the National Development Planning Commission. In addition to like the entity that supervises or oversees the higher education, which is the GTEC or Ghana Tertiary Education Commission, in addition to the Student Loan Trust Fund. That would be really valuable to have visibility or to establish real-time analysis as implementation is happening. There is a lot going on as we speak. There are some policy changes. Real-time analysis is definitely going to enable some sort of ongoing kind of modification, and also like to be aware of where we should be heading. Sensitivity modeling, that is definitely to capture impact of recovery rate or per the partnership initiative that we recommended. So we'll be able to monitor or at least come up with a mechanism to capture impact per initiative. Engage with the SLTF, and this is to kind of enhance number of applicants and also enhance maybe repayment models. And finally, to collaborate with research centers worldwide, and this is kind of to advance assessment efforts and work across the board with similar efforts. This concludes our research and also our presentation, and thank you.
Thank you, Natasha, and also Mohammed. I think we have time for a very quick question if we have any. Otherwise, we will just move to the end for questions. Do you have questions in the room? Question from online? Okay, maybe we'll come back if there's questions after all presenters have finished their paper. So shall we move on to Leon? Are you ready?
Yeah. Do I need to plug in over there? Or?
As you wish, you want to.
So if I just share my slides. Right, that's me. Can you hear me okay online?
Yes, I can hear you okay here.
So, and sorry, final question. How long do I have?
15 minutes, and then 5 minutes for Q&A.
Great,
yeah.
Thank you. Well, very interesting to follow that previous discussion, which was very in-depth on a substantial policy in a very different environment. This paper is about the experiences, pathways to higher education of young people in England who've had experience of the children's social care system. So it's a particular aspect of the question of widening participation. So I'm Leon Feinstein, the first of those authors. I run a centre in the department here called the Reese Centre, and we do research on children in and around the care system. So I've come at this topic much more from that background than from a background in higher education. But we were funded to look at the pathways into and through higher education of what I've called it children, young people with experience of children's social care, which is quite a subtle terminology I might spend a bit of time on. And this was a project that was funded by TASO, which is within the English context, a centre, a What Works centre funded by government to look at better evidence on higher education.
So put your camera so people online can see.
Sorry, camera's not on.
Sorry.
Thank you. Hi. So they funded this project 3 years ago. It took us quite a long time to get access to the data that we wanted, but we're essentially looking at pathways into higher education of a broad group of disadvantaged young people in England. A summary here of the overall questions that we were looking at. Essentially, this is a descriptive study. So we're looking at using national administrative data to understand the pathways into higher education of a group of young people that I'll describe further. So people might be familiar with the term care experience as a generic terminology for children who've had experience of the care system, but that tends to be for people who've been in care. That is to say, they've been removed from their birth families and placed in care of the state, whether as a foster child or in residential care in other ways. And that group sometimes are called care leavers. There is this odd definition of these groups for England where care leavers are not just any child who has been in care and has since left care. That would include all kinds of groups, like, say, adopted children. They're not part of the formal definition of care leavers. Care leavers are young people who were in care since they were 14 years old for 13 weeks or more and were in care on or after their 16th birthday. That definition matters because to be accepted as in need of additional support in HE, you have to be a care leaver. But there is a wider group of young people who maybe have been in care, that is to say, looked after by the state, by foster carers, or in residential care, or in other forms of care, but who are not formally care leavers. They are excluded from current statistics on entry to higher education, and indeed from a lot of support. So there's a wider group ever in care. And then there are three other groups, or two other groups that are actually larger than the group of care leavers. So children who've ever been on a child protection plan, or children who've ever been on a child in need plan. Those groups are not taken into the care of the state. They continue to live at home, but they have levels of difficulty in their home environment or in their personal lives that mean that at a sufficient level that the state steps in, and they will be receiving the support of a social worker in some way or other. For those on a child protection plan, for children in need on child in need plans, they formally met a legal definition of requiring additional support from a local authority by virtue of abuse, neglect, and other forms of interfamilial harm, but not at the level where they're taken formally into the care of the state. And so the point about this study is we were looking beyond just the care leaver group in terms of what are rates of entry to higher education of these broader groups. We compared outcomes. I'll talk briefly about outcomes. We compared outcomes for those 5 groups relative to another large group of disadvantaged young people, those in receipt of free school meals, that is to say, low income broadly, and then the general population. So we're looking comparatively across these 7 groups at a range of aspects of HE participation. We looked at entry to HE by age 22, where the age 22 is a constraint of the data. So it's unfortunate in that for many people, particularly those with more difficulty early on in life, very high rates of entry to higher education after age 22. But for our data, we were limited to age 22. We also looked at who entered in the traditional English route of entering the mainstream route, let's say, of entering HE age 18 or 19. We looked at types of institution attended, qualification pursued, and other outcomes. But I'm just going to summarize in relation to entry to HE by age 22. And the innovation of the study was linking these 5 data sets. So we've got the National Pupil Database, which gives a record of school achievement from Key Stage 2 onwards, that is already linked to the children looked after and the children in need data sets, which are national administrative data returns from local authorities into central government, which provide information on who is in care or in need. The innovation was to link those studies, those data sets, to the individualized learner record, which gives information on post-16 educational participation, and the higher education student statistics, which give information on HE participation. And we did this for a single cohort of young people, those born between 1st of September 98 and 31st of August 99. In other words, the 98-99 school year. We looked at their participation in further and higher education up to age 22. And obviously we could also describe in detail the care experience or the in need or child protection experiences of those young people. Just to give some basic description of the data. So we ended up with a population level data set of 556,000 young people, which is that birth cohort in the National Pupil Database. 16% of our sample had some experience of children's social care, where this term experience of children's social care is broader than just care experience. People tend to use care experience to mean taken into care. This is a broader group, and you can see there the 80% of that group are the children in need on the second tab there. 50% were categorized as in need for less than 6 months, so relatively brief experience of being a child in need. That is 50% of our 16% of the 556,000 were briefly in need. 30% were in need for more than 6 months, and then 7% were in child protection, 8% were ever in care, and only 5% of our group with experience of children's social care are actually formally categorized as care leavers. So there's a much bigger group of young people with not probably the same levels of experience of trauma and neglect, but very substantial levels of trauma and neglect who are not currently recognized in the forms of support or indeed the national statistics on HE participation. So we were looking at that question. I'm going to go quickly, so I will skip some of this. I just want to emphasize this is just descriptive data. We're just describing the patterns in the data. And I emphasize this when presenting to particularly care experience groups. These are average statistics. So these tell us about the state of society. They don't tell us about individuals. They're telling us about the barriers and the constraints that particular groups are experiencing. And any individual's journey through this FE and HE might be extremely variable. So I'm just describing averages as a way of describing the state of society rather than describing the experiences and perceptions of individuals, because we don't have data on perceptions or experience. We just have their administrative data records. I could talk a lot about this slide, the complexities of trying to construct a cohort study across those 5 data sets in which we don't have the date at which everything happened. So there are some complexities there, but essentially we've got 5 waves of data. So wave 2, what happened at the end of Key Stage 4, qualification achieved. At that age, 16, 17, starting FE, what was the registration, recognizing every young person in England, age 16, formally is required to continue in education in some way. And then at the end of the following 2 years, what was the level of qualification achieved? For those who did go into higher education, what was their initial registration? And then what did they achieve by way of a qualification by age 22? And that's the very simple structure of the data. So what do we find? So this graph shows you the rates of entry to higher education, by which I mean a level 4 qualification, rates of entry by age 22. So you can compare there. The total population is just the average across the entire data set. The general population, group 7, is the total population excluding those who are in the other groups, which is why it's higher. You can see there care leavers, 14% of care leavers in the data had entered higher education, started a level 4 qualification by age 22 compared to 56% in the general population. So rates of entry alter those of the general population. Same for those ever in care. For those ever on a child protection plan, broadly identical. For those children in need, for those long-term children in need, again, 18%, very similar to the care leaver rates of entry. So there's clearly a large group there who are not engaging well in education and higher education. And even for those who are short-term, a child in need, still rates of entry that are lower than the free school meals population, which is the standard indicator of disadvantage in the national statistics. So clearly these groups much lower rates of entry on average than even the average low-income child, never mind than for the general population. And broadly, those figures apply across all of the outcomes. The pattern is very similar. There isn't time to get into the really interesting detail in the paper. We've done regression analysis. This is population data, so everything is statistically significant, huge sample sizes. But essentially, even taking account of age 16 school achievement, those in the care groups are less likely to go into higher education. So even taking account what's happened to them through age 11 achievement, age 16 achievement, taking account of socioeconomic circumstances and all these other background characteristics, there is still a difference, a statistically significant difference in rates of entry to higher education for these groups and other young people. Although it's much smaller once you take account of those other characteristics. We looked, and there's not time to discuss the way this varies by special educational need, really important interaction with that. Gender, some really interesting results by sex, but the broad patterns as we look at these other covariates are the same as they are in the general population. So males much less likely to enter higher education in general, a bit less likely in general, and that's true across these groups. So for care leavers, male care leavers, only 1 in 10 had entered higher education by age 22. Higher rates for females, but still obviously low. And we looked at it, across a range of forms of intersectionality. The one other finding I'd like to emphasize, if I've still got time, is that 2 minutes or 2 seconds? 2 minutes. Thank you. So this is looking for those who went into higher education, what were their routes through further education? And the yellow box is what's interesting here. So for the general population, 58% of those who went into higher education took what we call the traditional pathway. So they went straight from GCSEs into A-level, they did A-levels, and then they went to university. 58% in the general population who went into higher education took that route. The yellow block is those who took a vocational route. So in the general population, it's only 13% of those who went into a level 4 qualification who came through a vocational route. Whereas for the care leavers, and indeed for all of those groups, including those on free school meals, vocational routes are much more substantive. So more young people who've been in care who went into higher education came through vocational routes than came through A-level routes. And what that's saying, which is not surprising, is we know that all of these groups in general, by the time of age 16 or 18, are pretty disengaged from the education system. Very high levels of suspensions and absences and exclusions and disengagement from mainstream education. So it's not surprising that there are low rates of entry to higher education, but it is interesting and I think substantive that for those who do get there, they're getting there through vocational routes. So, and interestingly also for those in the free school meals group, that is larger than for the general population. So disadvantaged young people getting disengaged from the education system, getting into a vocational training, work-based learning, a different environment than a school, where they're finding a way back into inclusion and into HE entry or into other outcomes. And I think that speaks very well about what our FE colleges are able to do, remediating some of the effects of our school system, which is proving to be very exclusive or excluding and from which many of these groups have completely switched off by the time they get to 11, never mind 16. So important differences between our groups, but in general, all of these groups, all 5 of those groups of young people with experience of children's social care have low rates of entry to higher education. Some suggestion that vocational routes are offering good progression for them. And just to say, it's not new to find that very many children and young people who've interacted with children's social care are also very disengaged from education. What was new here was showing that for those wider groups than just the care leavers, and that there are many young people here who are needing additional support and other routes into higher education and are currently excluded from it. And it does seem that we'd get a lot of benefit for HE entry if we had an enhanced FE offer, rather than just trying to put it all into the school's basket. Thank you.
Thank you, Leon, for the insightful presentation. Maybe do we have questions from this group?
I have a question. So, what would be like? Partly, what would be your answer? Why this is happening? That once children or young people get social care services, assistance, support, they are disengaged from education. What's going on?
So
What happened in the between? Yeah.
well, so I think it's important to say this is not, and you're not saying this, but that it's not the effect of the care. It's the effect of all the things that lead to them needing care.
Otherwise, we have to cross social care if we want educated people. Otherwise, something is wrong in this sentence.
Yeah, but
What do you think about this?
so it's a descriptive statement.
It is striking, but not new.
Yes.
Isn't it? We have a history of this.
Yes.
We should cross social care.
What do you mean cross social care?
Cross so delayed, or absolutely.
So 80% of young people in care, when asked, say that they are grateful for the care that they have received, which has transformed their lives for the better. So the issue is not the care. The care is the indicator of need. That's the argument that I'm making here. It's not that the care is causing additional problems. It's that that being in care or on a child in need plan is a signal, is an indicator that there are wider issues of trauma, neglect, and poverty and forms of deprivation that are influencing these children's development.
So here, because my point is that children's social care services should care about this, what you mentioned now, trauma, poverty. So basic education about the finances. What they are doing in here, that's happening here. Because, then we have people, all the money, taxpayers, they give for social care services, but the kids who are raised there will never bring the country up. Something is not okay in here, yeah?
But what's not okay here is the poverty and the deprivation. That's the problem.
So why in this first part is not resolved? Yeah? In good family is a child born and goes to education. If children's social care services is a good family, and let's pray that it is, we will have kids.
But if a child has already been experiencing years of neglect and poverty and difficulty, by the time they come into care or on a child in need plan, it's a very difficult situation. And bear in mind as well that a lot of these children who are in foster care, so they're going into care, their foster carers will be higher income than their home families, but still many foster carers are low income families. So they're still in environments where they're experiencing poverty, and all those experiences of trauma and disengagement are with them. And the challenge is, how do we have a care system and a school system that works with those children? And indeed, I think the point you're making is, how do we support families so that we don't end up with these problems in the first place.
We start from roots. We start from roots.
Yeah.
Sorry to
Yeah,
jump in.
very interesting. Thank you.
I think I have one question on learning.
Very good.
And maybe we come back after Britta has presented her paper, if that's okay, because we're already running a bit late now. And thank you for the question and the question. Britta, are you with us online? Are you ready to present now?
Yes, I am.
Okay, we can't see you. Okay, now we can. Do you have slides you want to share?
Yes, I will share my slides. Just, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you, and now we can, see the slides now. Okay. Yeah.
So you can hear me and you can see the slides.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity. So I will just briefly talk about the idea that access has to be meaningful, to enable success. Just providing access without the possibility of success, it does not really solve any of our problems. So what I will do briefly is to just talk about the National Qualifications Framework System in South Africa and where the problem lies as far as I see it. I've based some of my observations on a composite case study of students I've worked with over, I'm newly retired. I spent just a little bit about myself. I worked at the University of South Africa for 33 years, and then at our Council on Higher Education for the last 6 years. So I've worked a lot with individual students and trying to get them into the system and keep them in the system, so to speak. And so this is a case study of not one of the students, but a whole number of them that I've put into a composite just to make the point, really. So then I will develop what I call some student attributes as they are in the NQF level descriptors, and then look at some findings from this composite case study from my personal observations, just briefly discuss them and come up with some recommendations. So the National Qualification Framework System in South Africa consists of 10 levels. It works with articulation from basic education through the National Senior Certificate at NQF Level 5 into higher education, or you can go into the trades and occupations from the National Senior Certificate as well. You can enter the trades and occupations at lower levels already, but I won't talk about that. So for higher education, a National Senior Certificate, which is basically your school leaving certificate, usually around age 18, after 12 years of schooling, is at NQF Level 4. If you get it with what is called a diploma or bachelor's degree endorsement, you can go on to the what we call the Higher Education Qualification Sub-Framework on NQF Level 5. So that will typically be a university bachelor's degree or a diploma, a 3-year diploma at a higher education institution, a college or something like that. But you can actually get a school leaving certificate. This is the National Senior Certificate without this endorsement. And when you get it without this endorsement, you can go into a higher certificate on NQF Level 5 on the Higher Education Qualification Sub-Framework. So many of the students I worked with were these NSC students without a diploma or bachelor's degree endorsement, which went into the higher certificate at the University of South Africa. The University of South Africa is a comprehensive university, so it does offer, in addition to degrees from bachelor up to doctoral level, also diplomas and these higher certificates. So the problem really lies in that in South Africa we have a very high unemployment rate, and 3.6 million of the unemployed in South Africa are young people aged between 15 and 24, which are not in employment, education, or training. That's a huge number of young people who have nowhere to go and have no work, no prospects. And many of them who are over 18 will have this NSC without an endorsement, but not able to access any further kind of education. So just for arguments, for the sake of the argument, I call this composite case study Sipokazi. It's a composite of a number of students that I've worked with professionally as a senior academic leader in a large open distance learning institution, which offers academic qualifications and vocational and occupational and professional qualifications from tertiary, in other words, level 5 till 10. But I've also worked as a volunteer in 2 non-profit organizations, one a charity for orphans and vulnerable children, and another institution providing initial training in nature conservation for the wildlife guiding industry, which is a course at NQF level 2. So you will see that the school living certificate is at NQF level 4, in other words, 2 levels higher than this course. And this composite case study is based on participant observation. So what I want to do, let me just see if this is going to work. I'm going to just briefly go to my findings. I couldn't kind of get them in my PowerPoint, so I just have them. Yeah, so what you see here, can I just check? Are you? No. I'll get there. Sorry. Can you see it now?
Yes.
It was just easier to do this in Word, to put this much in PowerPoint is a bit difficult. So what I did basically is to compare the categories on the NQF level across NQF level 2, 3, and 4. So the categories include things like scope of knowledge in a discipline or of a specific discipline, and you'll see how they are described from NQF level 2, 3 to 4, and how it builds from 2, 3, and 4. So 4 includes what is on 3, and 3 includes what is on NQF level 2. So what I did, there are 10 of these categories. The 3 that you see here are related to disciplinary knowledge. So in a subject area, for example, it'll be in history or biology or that kind of a school subject. So what I tried to do was to separate these 3 disciplinary based ones from the more general attributes, and these are what I call the attributes, and I'll explain the color coding to you just now. Sorry, I'm just trying to get this to show. Okay, so you see I have tried to move the disciplinary categories out and just focus on what I call the socio-cognitive categories. Categories of outcomes, level descriptors that have to do with either social competencies or cognitive competencies. For example, knowledge literacy. On level 2, where it says you have to understand you have an understanding of your own knowledge, and that knowledge is gained through active participation. And then on level 3, you have to then understand that knowledge can be applied only if you understand the knowledge. So you have to understand the knowledge before you can apply it. And then at level 4, it's understanding how knowledge in one field can be applied to other fields. So you can see that these level descriptors on our SAQA, on the qualifications framework, are theoretically very sound. They are built up, building the competencies and so on. And then you'll see problem solving, accessing, processing, and managing information, producing and communicating information. You're managing your own learning, for example, to learn in a disciplined manner, going right up to NQF level 4, where you have to take responsibility for your own learning and be able to evaluate your own performance against given criteria. And then accountability, has a lot to do with managing your own time and teamwork, taking decisions and taking initiative. And then ethics and professional practice are also more social skills in the sense that you fit into your environment, you fit into an organization, you can adhere to a code of conduct and understand societal values and ethics. So the color coding here is really to show you that the students that I have met and worked with in those different settings all have an NSC at NQF level 4, but without a bachelor or a diploma endorsement. So they have passed their school leaving certificate, but they actually have not got any of these competencies. As I said, it's based on observing them in particular settings. The green ones, very interestingly, around accountability, ethics, and professional practice, are the ones that they do have. So very much more the social skills, if you like. These students have been in school, they've learned to work in teams, they've participated in organizations, they've been able to understand their society's values and ethics. But the issue for me is that they do not have the sort of metacognitive skills around knowledge literacy, problem solving, accessing, processing, and managing information, producing and communicating information, managing their own learning. So when I say that we should provide meaningful access, it would not be meaningful for a student who I would have evaluated in this way, as in the red, to then be given access to a university qualification at NQF level 5, and they don't have any of these skills. So just to get back to my presentation, sorry. So to access further education on NQF level 5 successfully, a student needs certain of these student attributes, which are described in the NQF level attributes. An NSC without a diploma or a bachelor's degree endorsement does not equip students with the relevant attributes to learn successfully at NQF level 5. Before I go to the recommendations, how much time do I have?
Maybe 2 minutes before the Q&A.
Okay, I think I actually skipped a slide. I just want to go back. Yeah, I skipped that slide for some reason, sorry. And I actually needed to. So the NQF level descriptors describe learning and learning achievement and the assessment criteria. And it is about applied competence. So what I want to make sure before I talk, talking about what I call student attributes or competencies, is that I certainly don't want to imply that these are in any way inherent or deterministic in any way. But because they are learning achievements that should be assessed, it's very important that we actually look, if we expect students to actually achieve this kind of learning, are we actually teaching them these kinds of competencies, and are we assessing these kind of competencies? So now I just want to go to my recommendations, because based on that, what we need to ask ourselves is the NSC examination, which is basically the school leaving examination in South Africa, assessing all these competencies, or are they just assessing disciplinary knowledge? So a student can basically get through the system with just a minimum of disciplinary knowledge and actually get the school leaving certificate, but not have any of these other attributes which they actually need to be successful in higher education. And then the second question that I think would be very important is, are we actually teaching these required competencies, or are we just focusing on the disciplinary knowledge? Really getting them to pass the NSC you know, this focus. And in South Africa, there's a big hype every year on the school leaving exam and how successful they are. And schools really get evaluated on how well they get the children through that school leaving exam. So there's a big hype around that. But it seems that they are focusing on disciplinary knowledge, but not on these competencies, which you actually need to then be successful in higher education, or even in other education. Some of these students actually then participated in an NQF level 2 qualification, which is 2 levels lower than their matric leaving, their school leaving certificate, and they still didn't have even those NQF level 2 competencies, and couldn't then achieve at NQF level 2, even though they have the national senior certificate at NQF level 4, which was kind of a shock for me. And you know, how are these young people ever going to be successful at any kind of intervention to try and give them access? If the access we give, you know, we can give them the access, we can find different ways of providing access to further education and training, but if they don't have these basic attributes that they need to be successful at that level, it becomes meaningless to me. And so the focus really should be on making sure that they actually have meaningful skills, competencies, and attributes that when given access, they can actually be successful. In this regard, then, because we have these 3.6 million needs currently, we need to look at what are we going to do with them in South Africa. And so I just briefly wanted to refer to the potential of micro-credentials, to really look at these different skills and try to see how we can work them into the system so that we develop those skills, so that if and when they do get access, that it is actually meaningful access for success. Thank you.
Thank you, Britta, for a wonderful presentation on competencies assessment and student knowledge. I wonder if we have any questions from the room. Do you have any questions from online?
There are no questions online, I don't see.
Okay, I actually have one question. So I was wondering, when you mentioned about disciplinary knowledge and also some more transferable competencies from a pedagogical perspective, like for teachers or for professors, how would they be able to, let's say, incorporate that into the curriculum in your context?
Yes, obviously I'm talking about this now at the sort of high school level, right? So as you say, that the teachers would actually have to be, well, the first thing that would have to change is that the assessment at the NSC level, at that NSC exam, the final school leaving exam in South Africa, is a national exam, right? It's set centrally, and every single school leaving child in South Africa writes the same exam, set of exam papers. So it's really about what is valued in those papers, right? And do they actually assess these competencies, or do they just focus on assessing disciplinary knowledge, facts, and you know, what the students have learned in terms of, yeah, basically regurgitating facts rather than assessing these competencies. So if you look at what is assessed and what is valued in that assessment, it would then spill back into what is actually taught in the classroom. But then obviously, as you say, your teacher education and your initial teacher training would have to take that into account and to make sure that the teachers actually understand these skills, which I don't think they always do, and competencies, and also how to teach them and to assess them at every level, because that is at NQF level 4, but at NQF level 1, 2, 3, you know, these skills are meant to build on each other. So if something happens at NQF level 3, and the students can't do that, how do you go back and actually teach them what should have been taught at NQF level 1 and 2? And this is really not a conversation we are having. We are having a whole lot of different conversations in South Africa, but not really. We have this really good theoretical framework of the NQF level descriptors, but it's not being used in a way that actually allows for that progression through the system.
Thank you, Britta. And thank you all the presenters for giving us wonderful papers. And we've covered a few different contexts and also different perspectives, and also our recommendations for how we can make access to higher education or tertiary education more equitable. And shall we give another round of applause for the